Welcome back to Sacred Conversations, where faith and identity meet. I'm your host, Drew. And before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe so that these conversations can continue reaching people who are seeking a deeper, more honest understanding of Scripture and faith. Can you believe we're already just weeks away from starting a new year? Time really does move fast, and seasons have a way of reminding us how quickly things change, even when we're standing still. Today's episode is titled The Nativity Revisited: Power, Politics, and the Birth That Changed Everything. For many of us, the Nativity story is very familiar. We know the imagery: the manger, the angels, the shepherds, the wise men. We see it every December. Peaceful, gentle, comforting. But imagery can sometimes flatten the meaning. When the Nativity is reduced to a children's pageant or sentimental tradition, we miss what the story actually is: a narrative born under empire, shaped by displacement and change, and charged with political and theological consequence. In this episode, we will explore the Nativity story in its original context, not as a children's pageant, but as a narrative rooted in empire, oppression, displacement, and radical hope. To understand the Nativity, we must first understand the world in which Jesus was born. Jesus was not born into a peaceful countryside untouched by politics. He was born into a world shaped by empire. At the time of his birth, Judea existed under Roman occupation. Rome governed through military force, taxation, and psychological control. Resistance was punished swiftly and publicly. Power was visible everywhere in soldiers, laws, and economic pressure. Local rulers like Herod the Great did not govern by popular will. They ruled at Rome's pleasure. Their task was simple: collect taxes, suppress dissent, and maintain order. And this matters because the Gospels are not neutral biographies, they are theological narratives written in conversation with empire. When early Christians said Jesus is Lord, they were not speaking only in spiritual terms. They were making a claim that stood in direct contrast to Rome's declaration that Caesar was Lord. The Nativity story begins as a counter narrative. Most people in Judea lived at a substance level. Rome's taxation system extracted wealth upward, leaving families struggling to survive. Religious taxes layered on additional burden. Mary and Joseph were not exceptions. They were part of a working class navigating economic instability without safety nets or institutional protection. And at the same time, Jewish communities lived with deep religious tension. They remembered covenant and exile. They longed for deliverance. Messianic hope was widespread, but expectations varied. Some awaited a warrior, others a reformer, others a prophet. What united them was belief that God would act. The Nativity does not reject this hope, but it redefines it. So let's talk about Mary's role, because Mary's role is often softened, but historically her situation was dangerous. She was likely between 12 and 16 years old. She lived in Nazareth, a small, insignificant village with no social or political leverage. Her pregnancy outside of marriage placed her at risk of isolation, public shame, economic vulnerability, long term suspicion. But yet, Luke presents Mary not as passive, but as choosing, asking questions, consenting with awareness. This is significant. Ancient texts rarely grant women agency, but Luke does. Mary embodies faith that exists alongside risk and not safety. The narrative acknowledges the social danger Mary faced and frames her pregnancy with a broader theological purpose. Mary's pregnancy would shape her life permanently. Even after Jesus' birth, questions about legitimacy lingered. References in the gospel suggest that Jesus' origins were a source of gossip and suspicion. Joseph's story reflects imperial and intrusion into everyday life. The census was not benign, it was a mechanism of control used to enforce taxation and loyalty. Compliance was mandatory. Joseph's journey to Bethlehem was not voluntary. It meant lost income, physical hardship, and instability, especially with Mary late in her pregnancy. Joseph is described as a tekton, which is commonly translated as carpenter, though the term likely referred to a general laborer or builder. This suggests a working class status dependent on steady physical labor for survival. Bethlehem itself was a small town, unprepared for the influx of travelers. So overcrowding was likely, and access to lodging would have been limited, especially for those without social standing or resources. So Jesus enters the world during displacement and not comfort. The image of the manger is one of the most familiar elements of the Nativity story, yet it is also one of the most understood. In popular imagination, the manger has become sentimental, a symbol of humility detached from its social and political implications. But in its original context, the manger communicates something far more specific and disruptive. You see, a manger was a feeding trough for animals. It was typically carved from stone or made of wood and located in spaces where animals were housed. These spaces were not designed for human habitation. They were unsanitary and associated with poverty. The Gospel of Luke specifies the manger not to invoke tenderness, but to emphasize circumstance. The detail signals the absence of conventional shelter and the lack of access to stable, dignified accommodations. It places the birth of Jesus firmly outside normal expectations of safety and propriety. This was not an aesthetic choice, it was a social reality. You see, in the ancient Near East, hospitality was a deeply valued practice, but it functioned within social hierarchies. Those with wealth, status, or extended family networks had access to better lodging. Those without social capital often did not. The lack of space for Mary and Joseph was not simply a matter of inconvenience, it reflects how overcrowding, limited resources, and social stratification work together to marginalize certain people. The birth of Jesus occurs at the intersection of displacement and exclusion. So, by locating Jesus' birth in a manger, the gospel narrative reframes how worth is measured. The story suggests that value is not determined by social standing, cleanliness, or legitimacy in the eyes of institutions. The manger communicates that divine presence is not confined to approved spaces. It appears in places that society overlooks or devalues. Theologically, the manger reinforces a central claim of the Nativity. God enters human history without relying on existing systems of power. The birth of Jesus does not depend on temples, palaces, or religious elites, and this choice signals a different understanding of how God engages the world. It suggests that transformation does not begin at the top of social hierarchies, but at their edges. The manger thus functions as a statement about access, belonging, and divine proximity. The announcement of Jesus' birth to shepherds is one of the most significant points in the Nativity story. It's often treated as a charming detail, but its historical context, it carries deep social, religious, and political meaning. You see, in the first century Judea, shepherds occupied a low social status. And while shepherding had deep roots in Israel's histories, figures like Abraham, Moses, and David were shepherds. The occupation had lost its prestige by the time of Jesus' birth. Shepherds were often viewed as economically poor, socially marginalized, ritually unclean due to constant contact with animals. They were also seen as unreliable as legal witnesses in some rabbinic traditions. Their work kept them away from religious institutions and regular participation in temple life. And as a result, shepherds lived on the edges of society, both physically and socially. Understanding this status is crucial because shepherds were not romanticized figures. They were people whose lives existed outside the center of religious respectability. The decision to reveal the birth of Jesus to shepherds first is not incidental. In the ancient world, important announcements were typically delivered to elites, priests, rulers, scholars, or even political leaders. The gospel narrative intentionally breaks this pattern. By choosing shepherds as the first witnesses, the story establishes a clear theological priority that divine revelation is not restricted to those with status, education, or institutional authority. This narrative choice suggests that truth does not depend on institutional endorsement and it can be revealed and recognized outside systems that determine who is allowed to speak. The shepherds do not remain passive recipients of the announcement. According to the narrative, they act. They go to Bethlehem, they see the child, and they share what they have been told. The shepherds are not asked to prove themselves, change their status, or purify themselves before encountering the baby. Their inclusion is immediate. Theologically, the shepherd's role challenges any framework that restricts spiritual access to those deemed worthy by religious institutions. It suggests that God's activity is not confined to temple spaces or priestly systems. Now, let's talk about the wise men. The appearance of the Magi or the wise men in the Nativity narrative introduces a critical shift in tone. While earlier elements of the story emphasize marginalization and vulnerability, the Magi bring the realities of power, politics, and international attention into focus. Their presence signals that the birth of Jesus is not only a personal or local event, but one with broader political implications. The Magi were not kings, despite later traditions depicting them as such. Historically, they were likely astrologers, scholars, or priests from the East, possibly Persia or Babylon. They were educated, influential, and associated with elite knowledge systems, particularly astrology and dream interpretation. So, in the ancient world, astrology was closely connected to political power. Celestial events were believed to correspond with changes in leadership, the rise and fall of empires, and divine favor. The Magi's interpretation of a star as signaling the birth of a king would have been understood as a serious political claim. Their journey suggests access to resources, networks, and authority far beyond that of local villagers or shepherds. So when the Magi arrive in Jerusalem seeking a newborn king of the Jews, their inquiry immediately alarms Herod. As a client king installed by Rome, Herod's authority was fragile. His legitimacy depended on imperial approval, not popular support. Any suggestion of a rival king, especially one identified through cosmic signs, posed a direct threat. Herod's response is not curiosity or reverence, but fear and calculation. And this reaction reveals an important dynamic. Power systems often perceive hope as danger. The Nativity story does not portray political authority as neutral, it presents it as defensive and self preserving. The gifts brought by the Magi, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, have often been spiritualized, but they also reflect economic and cultural realities. You see, these were valuable commodities associated with wealth, ritual, and burial practices. Their presentation underscores the paradox of the Nativity that costly gifts offered to a child born without material security. The contrast reinforces the narrative's redefinition of worth and significance. So, after visiting Jesus, the Magi choose not to return to Herod, and this decision represents a subtle act of resistance. They refuse to participate in a system that seeks to eliminate perceived threats. Their departure by another route carries symbolic weight. It suggests that encountering divine purpose can lead to ethical divergence from systems of power. The Nativity story is not only about the circumstances of Jesus' birth, it's also a theological statement about the nature of God. The choices embedded in the narrative communicate a specific vision of how God relates to the world, how divine power operates, and where sacred presence is found. The Nativity presents a God who enters human history not through dominance or spectacle, but through vulnerability. Unlike many ancient narratives in which God's arrival displays of force or grandeur, the Christian story begins with dependence. Jesus is born as a child requiring care, protection, and nourishment. And this form of the divine entry contrasts sharply with imperial models of authority, where power is demonstrated through control, conquest, and visibility. By the time the Nativity story reaches its conclusion, it becomes clear that Christmas cannot be understood solely as a celebration of sentiment, tradition, or seasonal familiarity. When examined in historical and theological context, Christmas emerges as reframing of how meaning, hope, and transformation are understood within, within human history. Over time, Christmas has accumulated layers of cultural meaning, family gatherings, rituals, imagery, and narratives that emphasize peace, joy, and comfort. And while these elements are not inherently negative, they can obscure the original substance of the nativity story. The biblical narrative does not present Christmas as a moment of universal calm or collective harmony, but instead it situates the birth of Jesus within instability, tension, and contradiction. So, reframing Christmas requires acknowledging that the story does not erase hardship, but exists within it. The birth of Jesus interrupts systems of power and it challenges established hierarchies. And it also introduces an alternative version of authority. Hope within the nativity story is not presented as immediate relief or resolution. It is a form of hope that exists alongside uncertainty and vulnerability. The promise embedded in Christmas is not that circumstances will instantly improve, but that meaning and presence are possible even within constraint. This reframing of hope aligns with the lived experiences of many who navigate ongoing marginalization, instability, or exclusion. Hope in this context is not escapism, it's endurance informed by vision. So, reframing Christmas also carries ethical implications. If the Nativity reveals divine presence among the marginalized, then the celebration of Christmas invites reflection on how societies and communities respond to the vulnerable. The story implicitly asks whether Christmas is merely commemorated or actively embodied. It challenges faith communities to consider how values associated with the Nativity, hospitality, inclusion, dignity, are practiced beyond the holiday season. And this reframing shifts Christmas from an event to an orientation. As we approach Christmas Day, I want you to reflect on three things this week. How does understanding the political and social context of the Nativity change how you view the birth of Jesus? Two, where do you see parallels between the world Jesus was born into and the world we live in today? I'm sure you'll find many similarities. What does it mean for faith when God shows up outside systems of power and approval? Thank you for joining today's Sacred Conversations. And as we move through this season, I invite you to reflect on what the Nativity truly represents, not just tradition, but transformation. I want you to have a very Merry Christmas and also a Happy New Year. And just remember to like and subscribe so that these conversations can continue and grow. Until next time, We'll continue exploring scripture with fresh perspective and historical clarity. Stay grounded, stay curious, and stay in love. Until next time, bye.